Postmodern. Hi, Jason. Welcome everyone to another episode of Talks with Toe. I'm here joined once again by Joshing.
Hi everyone.
How's your day been, Josh?
It's been great. Woke up and then we had breakfast with a friend talking about haven't seen him in a while, so I catch up with him, and then we talked about we went to a book club discussion by an on-campus ministry called Reformed University Fellowship, and we talked about a book called The Reason for God by Tim Keller.
Oh yes, I've heard of that book.
Yes.
Okay. Interesting book. Okay. Well, we'll definitely talk about all of those things.
Yeah, we will.
But today, the topic is really, I guess, common questions that get asked in churches in general, either from within the church, and when we're talking about the church, we're talking about mostly Protestant Christian churches.
Yes.
And also questions that might come from outside the church as well that are very common.
Yeah.
So I know you might have already thought of some of those questions, but what are some of the most common questions that you hear? Let's start with from outside the church first, since that's kind of a little bit more general and probably what people think of. What are some of those questions?
Yeah, Tim Keller's book has illustrated that perfectly, but I'll also speak from my personal experience because, of course, Tim Keller ministered in a church in New York City, so that's a lot different than churches in, let's say, Hong Kong or in California, especially in Southern California. So I guess in California, in my time in Santa Cruz or my time at Irvine, the most common one that I heard of is that why do we need God when we have evolution, or the scientific method, or when we have technology to figure out stuff.
And as a psychologist / you're hoping to be a clinical scientist at some point.
Sure.
What is that's very common in academia.
It is.
It is very common. So what is some of the general discussions you've had with people about that?
Yeah, I remember evangelizing to a particular individual, and he is a biology major at UCI, and he raised that question, and I asked him, what do you specifically mean by those words? Because sometimes I felt especially in the field of psychology, and for a lot of psychologists, they don't usually define their terms that well. They just spit out a term that they think they might have a generic understanding of those terms, but they don't exactly know what they mean by that. So I was pushing him a little bit on that. I think I'll give you my apologetic to that my defense to that argument first, and then I'll maybe put out my thoughts on why people have those questions raised behind the psychology behind it. So I defended it this way. I asked him, what do you mean by those terms? And this individual, he got stumbled a little bit because I told him I thought of, when I think of evolution at least, I can think of at least 3 different definitions. I can think of microevolution, I can think of macroevolution, or just a general sense of change. He got stumbled, and he was forced to think a little bit about that. And he said, macroevolution. It evolved from a single cell to many different species. That kind of.
Okay. Maybe for some listeners who aren't as familiar with the differences between, because obviously you and I are very familiar with the differences between micro and macro, and just the general term evolution that people use in day-to-day terms. But for someone who's not in the scientific field, how would you define those 2 terms, just so we can clarify how we're talking about them?
Yeah. So if I were to distinct micro and macro, so micro implies small change. So, for example, common example in the medical field, a virus or a bacteria changed their genetic information to adapt to a certain drug or a certain medicine so that they can continue to survive and to continue to spread. That would be actually the evidence for microevolution. Macroevolution is big change. It means to evolve from it's what people commonly think of, I guess, evolution. They would think of single species changing either suddenly or slowly into different distinctive species with distinguishable features.
Right, and that would basically Darwin's theory of evolution.
Sure, totally.
Falls more in the macro evolution idea.
Totally. And this individual was talking about macro, big change, instead of the other two kind of senses, just change or small changes. I told him that even so different Christians would have different opinions about macroevolution. I think most apologists would say that they have doubts about macroevolution. I personally don't really know my stance on macroevolution, but usually I go with just assuming that macroevolution is true still. I told him that, but still, we still need faith in the scientific method. We still need to have fundamental assumptions, such as the scientific method works so that we can observe evolution, whatever definition that you use. I told him that even the chair that you're sitting on requires you to have faith to sit on. And even if evolution is true, we can have two sense of definition of God from there on. We can either be a deist, thinking that God created the world and then left it to its own being, and then let evolution take over, or we can say that God used evolution as a mechanism, as a mechanism or his means to bring about his glory, which is, I think, most Christians would adhere to, provided if they subscribe to evolution.
Yeah, I think one of the better explanations that I've ever heard is actually from a scientist, a very well-known scientist here at UC Irvine. His name is Dr. Gregory Brewer.
Totally.
He became a Christian when he was in graduate school, actually, and he's one of the people who basically figured out how we could culture neuron cells and keep them alive for longer than an hour. So he's very well known. He's one of the pioneers in neuroscience. But he said a very interesting thing in the panel that we had talking about faith and science. But he said there's a lot of big gaps in scientific knowledge still when it comes to the ideas surrounding evolution specifically.
Yeah.
And I'm probably not remembering all the ones. I think he had 4, but I can probably only think of 3 right now. The first one is we don't have a fundamental understanding of nothing to something, meaning we still don't have a fundamental understanding of how nothing became something, as in there was nothing and then there was matter. And then we don't have a fundamental understanding of something to life, so that means we don't understand how from matter you get life, and then from there we don't have a fundamental understanding of how life became complex life, human life. So there are still very large gaps in scientific knowledge. And I think most people in our culture, at least in the Western culture, think evolution and think that it's a completely proven science. There's evidence for certain aspects of evolution, like microevolution, and there may be some evidence for certain aspects of macroevolution, but not much between the jump between a bacteria to a human.
Sure.
A lot of that is really inferred. So it's a little bit we think this is the theory prevailing, but there's not an incredible amount of evidence because we can't reproduce it. So so that's one of the better explanations I've heard about that kind of the stance of as a Christian, how do you approach something like evolution? Because I think most regional people would be well, yeah, things are possible because God can do whatever. But,
sure.
Okay, that's an interesting one.
Totally.
Yeah.
To explain the psychology, though, I think cognitive dissonance is probably, I think, the most important thing. It's probably the thing that got me into psychology about cognitive dissonance. And that is to mean that one could say something. Let's say they say X. But then what they do and what they believe is not X. It's the opposite of X. And I think one of the most profound studies on that would probably, which indirectly demonstrate that, is Milgram's study on. If I were to summarize what his study was he had a middle class American participants in the mid 20th century, and he he asked him to basically electrocute someone. 99% of the psychiatrists at the time, not 99, more so 95 or 90, they thought that they're all going to refuse. But they did. 100% of the participants passed a certain threshold. Of course, like, we would all say that, oh, well, I'm totally not gonna electrocute that person now. But the data suggests that we will. Suggesting that we hold a certain belief, but when in practice we don't. The cognitive dissonance here, and especially regarding to evolutionary theory, I think, is that we hold to a belief that we say that we could say that material is all there is. Evolutionary theory is sufficient for us to explain species or the origins of species. But the dissonance would be to fill in gaps that are assumed, but not necessarily actually observed, like you said, especially on macroevolution, I would say.
Yeah, there was another very interesting study. They did something similar to Milgram's study. I think they were kind of like trying to reconfirm Milgram's study, but they had a group of individuals. They were supposed to work together to build a puzzle in the dark, but they were told that there was another team trying to beat them.
Right.
But they never saw the other team. They don't know the other team exists. There actually wasn't another team.
Sure.
And they were given the ability to press a button to like make noise in the other room, and then they could adjust the volume. So they found that like you can tell people that if you go to 10, it's like very dangerous for the other people. But at a certain point, if you hit them enough time with like just like a level 3 sound, people in the general would like try to like crank it up higher to beat the other team.
Oh yeah.
So like that was like a very interesting psychological study also.
Oh yeah.
So it's very similar to Milgram's study because it showed that people on some level were like, oh, we're not going to do that to people because like that's like just kind of
terrible.
mean. Yeah. But then if you tell them that you're in a competition and you tell them that there's another team trying to beat you and you never actually see the other team, then they just assume that the other team is like there's like a dissonance there because like they don't see the people, so they don't like actually.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very interesting one. So maybe now pivoting to questions that you get in the church specifically. There are a lot of like very difficult questions that are talked about within the church.
Yeah.
And I think most people outside the church may not be aware of them.
For sure. Yeah.
But on some level, they're aware of them because they're like, why do Christians disagree on things? Which is a fair question. But on another level, I don't think they think that Christians actually are discussing these topics. To be fair, some Christians aren't. But within like the actual like churches, like most pastoral staff have spent like lifetimes like discussing these topics. So what are some of those questions that you run across?
I think probably one of them. I think even non-believers ask this too, but for us believers, we have been asking that too, is why God permits evil, or how could a good God allow evil to exist within, like, this is a question that is raised even within the church, and some people struggle with that. And because of some people struggle with this, some people actually eventually leave the faith because they cannot reconcile the two. To which, like, they have a certain merit to that kind of thinking, but I think like there are people who are unable to reconcile those two oftentimes have a very skewed or a very misunderstood notion of goodness, justice, and truth, I guess. So of course, like we would say, like when someone is born with cancer, when someone is executed for no reason, like we think those things as evil. And for within the church, at least, like if you confess Jesus is your Savior, if you confess the Bible is the infallible truth that the Lord has revealed, then you have no problem accepting that there is objective evil and there is objective good. And this is not a question that Christians would dispute on. It's the question where we dispute on is why would a good and loving God allow these things to happen when he knows they're going to happen? Especially for us, for my specific kind of denomination, orientation, Reformed view, God's sovereignty. He is sovereign over evil. How could that be if he is good and if he's just? And I think the contemporary evangelical church in our age, in the 21st century, and especially like late 20th century, focuses a lot on the humanistic kind of analysis, anthropocentric analysis of the biblical view, the biblical narrative. But
and when you say anthropocentric, you mean like people centered, basically.
People centered, yes. Human centered, man centered. That is to say that the Bible is about men. The Bible is about God's provision for men, or the Bible is for the good of men. God is for the good of men, which they're not necessarily wrong. I think that they're true in their own merits, because the Bible does talk about God is loving. He loves his people, and he provides for his people. However, the Bible is also very strong and very clear about his wrath, his justice, and justice often is divine. Not even in Christian circles, but in secular circles too. It means to be fair, to be equally, to treat everyone and everything equally. And the Bible is clear about this when the apostle says, "For all have sinned and fallen short from the glory of God," in Romans 3, and the wages of sin is death in Romans 6. A just God should have punished us because we have all sinned, because we have fallen short from his glory.
Yeah, I think one of the quotes like the question is not why does God punish people for doing evil.
Sure.
The question is, why did God choose to save us at all?
Yeah, exactly.
Is the question.
That's the Reformed question. Like, why save us at all when we have fallen short from the glory? When we should have been condemned, when we should have been separated, he still saves us. That is, I think, what the true gospel is. It's that when we have sinned, he still saves us. Not because of what we do, not because of what we believe. It's simply because of his sovereign grace for us, and he allows us to see what is true.
Yeah, I think one of the, kind of tying into this, but one of the questions that, at least the church I attend, has really been kind of debating internally about is the concept of hell in general, right? Because I think most people's perspective of hell, even if you're not within the church, is very colored by the culture's definition of hell, like fire, whatever, fire and brimstone, right? Is like the typical term, in,
totally,
at least in the American
narrative
of it. But when you actually look at the Bible, like the specifics about like the passages mentioning hell are actually very brief.
Yes. In
most cases.
Still very vague.
Yeah, there's a lot of vagueness in that, other than the fact that it does exist.
Right.
And that the result of that is, like, the reason hell exists is because of its, like, permanent, like, separation and eternal, like, punishment and judgment by God. But even then, people get really tripped up about the idea of eternal judgment versus eternal punishment.
Sure.
And how hell is, like, how hell plays into that. So I don't know if you've ever run into those types of discussions before, but
I certainly have, especially when I was in my first quarter at UC Santa Cruz, because like I was exposed to the New Age and exposed to like stuff like that, and of course like New Agers, they would think that you're good and God is for you, and hell doesn't exactly exist. It's a concept that the church has invented. Of course now I confess that hell is a place, and it's real, and it's a place for God to punish those who rebelled against him. There are certainly discussions, like we don't know exactly the mechanisms of hell because of, again, the vagueness. scholars have been talking about that all the time. Personally, I don't really have an opinion either, I guess, because it's so vague. I haven't studied enough about that to have my own opinion. Other than again, I think it's real.
I think on like at least on a psychological level, it's like very interesting because you have this weird problem if you say that God is just and hell doesn't exist. And people might like be like, wait, what do you mean by that? But like, if there is no consequence for evil,
sure,
and if there's no confidence for wrongdoing, like, do you really have justice?
Right.
And as if people ask like, well, why would God send people to hell? It's like, well, that's a difficult question to just ignore because it's like, well, if you don't have a consequence for evil, then what is the point of not doing evil?
Sure, yeah.
Right? And as humans, like, it's very clear that evil is a predisposition among us. And like, you know, people might disagree on what levels of evil constitute what level of consequence. But again, like, it's very clear that we don't have a good answer to that either.
No.
Because we've been struggling with that as a society for years. Like, the idea of a death penalty is like most people don't agree on.
Sure.
And like, you go country to country, like, it's completely different too. Like, you're in an Islamic country, like, the death penalty happens all the time.
Sure.
If you're in China, it also happens all the time too. In the United States, it used to happen all the time.
Yeah, but
even that has been like very debated recently, right?
Sure, yeah.
So, yeah, that's an interesting one.
Totally.
Yeah, what do you think about how do you think that the academic institutions have been shaping like these questions, both from within the church and outside the church? Because there's an interesting trend going on, at least in churches that claim to be the more non-denominational churches. So churches who say, like, you know, we're Christians, but we don't adhere to like
a certain doctrine. Okay. Of course, like I do not neglect the fact that I have a personal like commitment and personal like conviction of certain doctrines to make this comment. But I think to say that we don't adhere to any doctrines in any way in itself is a doctrinal belief. To say that we have no creed but Christ in itself is a creed. I think those are not very deep, and not only so, but not, I think, rebelling in a sense, rebelling against what God has said and told us to do. Because, for example, if we take like Psalm 119, the psalmist says that he reflects on his word day and night because of his sin. Like he wants to, but now because God's grace is shown to him, he wants to reflect on his word. And reflecting on his word is gonna unavoidably help you to develop a certain tradition and a certain doctrine. Not to say that a tradition is equal as the scripture itself, but it's unavoidable. To say that there is no creed but Christ is in itself, once again, a creed that you have reflected on and to produce.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. And I think I had a very interesting conversation when I was at UCLA with people about I think the comment I made was like, on some level, everyone operates as if there is a God, even if they claim that they do not.
Sure.
And what I meant by that was like, even if you are a proclaimed atheist, you are more than likely working in your life for something.
Sure.
And if you're working in your life for something, then obviously you are acting as if that something is your God.
Totally.
To a certain degree, right?
Totally.
So,
the objects of worship.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think, in some sense, like, academia operates similarly.
I think so too. Yeah.
And that source of work is typically humanistic. Yeah. Very much so. But increasingly so, it's also just I don't know. I think operating as a Christian within academia is a very interesting place right now.
Oh, yeah, I think so too. Of course, like, I think people who are Christian academia is still being respected. For example, our colleagues from UCI, Dr. Brewer, Dr. Rickensmeyer, they're professing Christians, but like people don't really take fault or really take offense by their religious belief. But still, because of like the more liberal, more left-leaning, perhaps, commitments. That's not an exclusive thing to politics, but I find some right-leaning and conservative Christians might have those mindsets too. Is that there are certain commitments that these individuals have that is perhaps, to say it, it might be a little bit harsh to say, but I think are not biblical. They might be actually straying away from the Bible, so that they're favoring a human tradition or a human commitment over a biblical or a godly commitment.
Yeah, I think I've definitely noticed that too. There's a growing trend of, I would say, younger Christians who claim to be Christians but adhere to the doctrines of the liberal. I wouldn't say liberal in the sense of like. It depends on how you define liberal, right?
Yeah.
So like, I would say the far left leaning doctrines, right? There is a larger segment of Christians who adhere to, politically adhere to left leaning doctrines without really fully engaging in what that actually means.
Sure.
Part of it is because President Trump is a polarizing character, which like I think everyone would agree on.
Yes.
And like. But because of that association that President Trump is associated with the Republican Party at the moment, like, means that it's a lot of younger Christians have basically started to abandon fundamental aspects about the political right, and are full sail embracing the political left without understanding the implications of what that means.
Right.
So I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? Like, what do you think about? Because you obviously have kind of spent a lot of time in that camp for a while as like the political left, so to speak.
I have been a leftist for a little while, actually. Yes, until recently, I have. I guess like it has been a progressive like going to the middle and then more to the right now. So so my experience in the left was that, especially among left-leaning Christians, politically left-leaning Christians, is that they have a mindset of basically a workspace kind of social justice kind of gospel. What that means is that they say that yes, this is the end times. Jesus is going to come, and in Christian theology, in case for the audience doesn't know.
So we're supposed to be talking about left-leaning professing Christians.
Yes,
people who say they're Christians but are incredibly left-leaning on their political.
Oh, totally, yeah. But generally speaking, Christians have what is called an end times kind of theology, and what we mean by that is that there is this time between Jesus ascended into heaven and Jesus eventually going to come back down on earth, and that's the day of judgment for the Christians. And this time in between, the left-leaning Christians would say that we have to do social justice work. We have to do the things that Christ has commanded us to do in order to make the world a better place. And eventually the world is going to become the perfect heaven that Revelation had described. And then that's when Jesus is going to come. Okay, of course, personally, I have a different conviction than that. I think that the world is going to be becoming more chaotic, more sinful, more rebellious against God, and eventually one day Jesus is going to come and restore everything. That's my view. But I want to stick focus on the left-leaning view, is that they're very social justice orientated. Now, I'm not saying that social justice in itself is bad, because I think it's coming from good intentions. I think to help people who are oppressed, helping people who are in need. I think those are great Christian. They're Christian values. They're Christian commands that Christ has commanded us to do. Yet they put the law, just like the Pharisees, which Jesus has critiqued. They put the law before. They put the law before Jesus. They put the law before pursuing Jesus. Now, pursuing Jesus is the life virtue, the lifelong commitments of a Christian. Yet they are not pursuing that. They're pursuing the command of Jesus to make the world, which is temporary, a better place, but eventually it's going to pass away. And but they also say that if you don't do this, you're not a Christian, which I think is in itself not very biblical as a critique.
I think what I find a little bit disquieting about, because I also would say that at one point I was more on that left-leaning, like liberal camp of Christians. So like, like obviously we want to help with, migrants, refugees, that type of stuff, as the buzzwords are nowadays. Like, clearly as Christians, we want to help with that camp.
Yeah.
And, like, with those people, because they're most likely people who do not know God.
Yes.
But what I found more and more is that there is this interesting doctrine within the left-leaning Christian camp that the way to achieve this is through government.
Yes.
Which, on one hand, seems a bit antithetical to what they're trying to do.
Right.
But on the other hand, it makes sense if you have embraced the party that is very good at professing these things, right?
Sure.
So the Democratic Party, because that's just the party that is always talking about the immigrant right now, is like they've gotten very good at branding it that they are for the immigrant.
Sure.
But their solution, when you look at it, is a government controlled solution.
Sure, totally.
And as a Christian, I feel like that's a very interesting. It causes some issues because you have this very difficult aspect where some Christians say, like, there's a lot of disagreement on this. So some Christians say, like, we should be involved in politics.
Sure.
And we need to, like, do what we can to affect the world through the politics that we're given, as broken as it is. Okay, fair enough. And then other Christians will say, well, politics is not the solution. The church is the solution.
Sure.
I tend to lean more to that view, where if you're not careful, you'll make government your god.
Sure.
Because you'll assume that by supporting certain political agendas, you will be helping people.
Sure, yeah.
But on the other hand, I think history has kind of shown that if you support the government, then you're enabling the government to oppress more people.
Sure.
And that's the view that I have, like, slowly kind of arrived at over time.
Sure, totally.
And I don't know if I know obviously we're at the same place, but
right.
I did find that a very interesting topic because I've kind of been watching the trends within the younger church, especially in California, over the past, 4 years or so.
Yeah.
And it's clear that there's becoming an increasing divide within the younger church even about this topic specifically.
Oh yeah, totally. I think, like, my personal conviction has been more so, my personal reflection has been more so stemming from my personal background as a non-citizen and non-green card holder. That I'm on a visa right now. I'm on a student visa, non-immigrant visa. When I think of, like, when I see my peers, especially in Santa Cruz, a lot of them are actually DACA students. I empathize on one aspect that their parents, because of their parents making a decision to move to the U.S., probably not by legal means, and to escape persecution and to pursue a better life. I can empathize with that because in some sense I kind of want to leave Hong Kong in that kind of sense too, but I came by legal means. But at the same time, for the left-leaning parties in the U.S., especially the Democratic Party, to brand their whole policy as, like, for immigrants, they are, and they're, if you define, like, for immigrants only for, like, those who are persecuted, those who are sorry to say this, those who came in illegally but to seek certain status, I think that's totally fine. Yet when doing that, they're hurting people like me who came in through legal means, because those who came in without legal status, they can take jobs that are low maintenance, low skill, and it becomes more difficult for people who wants to come in legally to get those jobs. And and as a result, like the bottom, like the low skill like market is completely cut off, whereas the middle class or the middle skill and also the high skill level classes are becoming more competitive, and this becomes a problem for legal immigrants.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting topic, because for a long time I didn't understand like why my parents held that view because like when you're in the university, all you hear is that we got to help these DACA students because they're undocumented students, and like obviously like people want to help other people who, you know, especially if you're a person who grew up here just because your parents brought you and you had no say in that, like that's totally understandable. But the solution definitely does affect the people who came in legally.
Sure.
Because that branding that the Democratic Party is for the immigrants is not entirely honest, I think.
No,
because
I think they're really targeting the undocumented people instead of the documented people.
Yeah, and I think obviously the Republican Party has issues too, because their counter to that was basically like, let's just stop all immigration, you know? Which is like also kind of dumb. Like, but it's an interesting place, because I think, at least in California specifically, like it's swayed a lot of younger Christians. I would say like under 30, towards embracing a more postmodern view of the world. And most people don't even realize they're embracing a more postmodern view of the world.
Totally,
what are your thoughts on that, especially like just how postmodernism is just influencing the church? Yeah.
I think, well, first of all, I don't subscribe to postmodernism. That's I think the view of like there is no truth is just self-refuting, so I can't subscribe to that.
But it's also sinister, because like most people don't realize that they're subscribing to that. Yeah,
totally. So I think one of the reasons why is because churches nowadays, especially those the churches that claims to be non-denominational, they seems to be doing a lot of things that seems to attract the younger generation, such as let's have smoke machines, let's have like really energetic worship, which I don't find those things to be exactly wrong, because they could be great things if used in the right context. But I think that the doctrinal teaching, the teachings, the sermons are not exactly exegetical from the Bible, but more so about the culture, the contemporary culture that we have right now. Now, people might object that, well, Paul's like epistles, Jesus's sermons, Peter's epistles are addressing the culture at the time, which is true, but they're all countercultural. To say nobody in the Bible says that subscribe to your culture and to fully embrace your culture. Nobody ever really said that. People have been saying people have been saying that, yes, God has given you a certain cultural context that you grew up in. God has given you a certain cultural background that you grew up in, and they have their beauties in it. But remember, the Lord is your God. The Lord is one.
I think what people always leave out is that there are parts of cultures that are very bad.
Yeah.
Like, there's this view that's, started in academia but creeping into the church even, that like somehow like American culture is like inherently like worse than other cultures, or like, oh, we should embrace other cultures. I was like, well, if you mean like we should embrace the good aspects
of the culture
of other cultures,
I can agree.
That point to God, like for sure. But there are aspects about like other cultures, especially like Chinese culture, that are good and bad. Like So yeah, that part is always left out, which I find is interesting.
Oh yeah, totally. I think it has, again, to stem from the ignorance, I think, from not to say just the left, but I think like of just people in general about other cultures. They oftentimes neglect, like you said, the ugly aspects of other cultures. For example, as Christians ourselves, we believe that the Lord is one, and He's the only object of worship, as the first commandment commands us. In Chinese culture worships ancestors or other spirits and other gods. Now, we say we embrace Chinese culture, let's say. Do we embrace those two as Christians? Of course not. Because we can't. Because the Lord is our God. It becomes a problem for those who adheres to a social justice gospel or a liberal theology gospel. That they might think that, well, maybe God can have a leeway. I'm like, no, he would not have any leeway in that. If you read what he says in Deuteronomy and Isaiah, especially those Israelites, when they're in exile, they worship other gods, and God condemns them for doing that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because Israel's a whole other topic.
Sure, yeah.
But the Jewish state is also like something that I think is oddly left out in these conversations sometimes, because it's like people are like, oh, we have to embrace these cultures, but like Judaism is like a very interesting one. Sure. Because there's like the category of people who are ethnically Jewish and the category of people who are actually practicing Judaism.
Sure.
Yeah, that's interesting. I would be interested to know like how Jewish people view multiculturalism in general.
Yeah, I'm interested in that too. I think I might have some idea, but I can't say because I'm not Jewish and I don't hold to Judaistic beliefs. I think if we were to take like the Pharisees' view in Jesus' time, they're essentially Zionist. They think that they are the actual like world superpower. It's just they're under Roman oppression or something like that. Hard to say if Orthodox Jews today have the same beliefs, but I heard some people there are Zionists still around.
Oh yeah, there's definitely Zionists still around. There's even politically they exist in the Jewish parliament.
Sure, totally.
Which I think shouldn't be that surprising, but for some reason people are still surprised by it. I don't know.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Do you have any other? We've talked about a lot of topics, and like that was some pretty good discussion.
We did, yeah.
But do you have any like other topics that you think are common things that people bring up within the church?
Yeah, two things. I think there are two misunderstanding of the Christian faith that people nowadays in the church, in American evangelical churches, believe. I think the first thing is that humans are good. That's the first, I think, misunderstanding. And the second misunderstanding is that Jesus was created. Now, Jesus was created is pretty simple to address. When we look at John 1:1, when it said that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and then later on it says the Word became flesh, which is Jesus. And it specifically says the Word is God. Who is the Word? Jesus. So Jesus is God. So God cannot be created. End of story. So Jesus was not created. So I would urge our evangelical friends to stop believing in Jesus being created and adapting that he was not and he is God. About we're good. Oftentimes people would say that we're good because we're created in the image of God. And God is good, therefore his image has to be good. I don't actually have too much problem prior to the fall of that. The fall means Adam and Eve took the forbidden fruits and then they sinned.
Right, so it's really just the topic of original sin.
Sure,
right?
Totally. So before the original sin, at least in my specific tradition, in the Reformed tradition, we believe that God did create all things and all things are good. It's only until God left Adam to his own will, to the freedom of his own will, he took of the forbidden fruit and then he sinned. But according to Romans 5, from then onwards, his posterity, i.e. his descendants, his entire descendants of him, is corrupted. And original sin is not only original sin, but we are all sinners, as Romans 3 says. All have sinned and fallen short from the glory of God because Adam sinned.
Yeah. I think that's an important thing because like if you don't have that, like there's no point in following Jesus.
Sure.
Like people don't like being told that they're evil. But like you and I both know ourselves enough to know that there are aspects of us that are obviously evil and obviously sinned. And that if it wasn't for morality or whatever people want to call it, like if people were left to their own devices, it's very clear in the world what would happen.
Sure.
So on one hand, circling back to that original question of like, why does God let evil happen in the world? It's like, well, on some level, like, it's happening because of us. Like,
yeah, because he is kind of pronouncing his judgment.
Yeah, and like, because we, like, the fact that we are not good is precisely why evil is happening.
Yes.
Which is really this essential aspect of the Christian message, which I think is surprising to me that people don't adhere to that anymore.
Especially in the church, yeah.
Yeah, and like when I started to realize that, it was kind of just like, wow, there's a real problem like within our culture that is more deep rooted than I expected.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure, totally.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, I mean, there is hope. So
there is hope. Jesus, he's sovereign, and I believe he changes our hearts.
Mm-hmm.
So Holy Spirit is going to enlighten us.
Yeah. What would you say to maybe the scientists who are listening to this,
Sure.
Who may or may not be Christians? I mean, there are a lot of scientists who are Christians.
Yeah.
I think statistically there's like 30%, which is like a third or something like that. What would you say to scientists in general about approaching these topics within both people that they know who are churchgoers and even people who are in academia? Because on some levels, they're both institutions.
Of course they are, yes. I'm not going to deny the church is also an institution. But for scientists who are interested in the topics of, let's say, religious faith, or like religious beliefs or faith in general, I would encourage those who are scientists to first examine the scientific method itself and the scientific institution itself. Those who are listening, when you examine closely, the scientific method in itself doesn't have scientific proof to itself neither. It's a thing of abstractness. It's a thing of metaphysics. It's a thing of philosophy. With that, it requires faith, and it requires things that are not physical. To say that everything is made out of physical components, and like Francis Crick put it in his astonishing hypothesis, that is self-refuting, because even that statement in itself is just a bunch of molecules working together, but we extract meaning from things. We have exegesis on things.
Mm-hmm.
So think about that. Reflect on that a little bit. Reflect if science is able to actually state philosophical or even theological things. That might be the first hurdle. And if you have gone through that hurdle, I recommend you to think about what means for something to be true. Of course, we can say, well, I self-define it, but it's only yourself. What if someone doesn't agree with you? Of course, then some people would say there's no objective truth. But now the question is that statement in itself is objectively correct?
Right.
They have to keep on going forward until they hit a stumbling block. Until you hit a stumbling block, you say, I can't. Well, then I'll encourage you to look forward to what Jesus says in the Gospels and what the apostles wrote in the epistles. See what they say about these things. I would encourage you to, especially if you're a scientist, I encourage you to look at Romans, the book of Romans, or if you're interested in what Jesus says, look in the book of John, I would say.
Cool. Well, thanks for coming on again, Josh.
No problem. I appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure. This has been brought to you by Black Forest Organic Gummies. Go to Costco. They don't actually give us money. I just like these gummies. So.
They're great gummies. So.
They are great gummies. Well, thanks for listening, guys. If you have any other questions, feel free to drop likes, comments, subscribe to us, and have a good weekend. Be sure to like and subscribe to Talks with Toe on Spotify, and also give us that 5-star rating on iTunes. Talks with Toe is written and produced by Chris Toe.